Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm really excited to be speaking with Niels Feddersen. Niels, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Thank you very much, Dan. Pleasure to be on.
Really excited to have you on. Why don't we get started by having you introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, well, where to start? I'm Niels. You can think about that as one Neil, two Niels. That's how we say it in Denmark, where I'm from. I did my PhD at Liverpool John Moores, where I research primarily culture change and destructive cultures in Olympic elite sports. And I'm currently a postdoc, which means that I just basically do research at a university in Norway called the Norwegian University for Science and Technology. And I also have a background as a practitioner in sports psychology, primarily within rowing at the under 23 and under 19 youth national teams in Denmark.
What got you into sports psychology in the first place?
Christopher Henriksen, to be honest. So we'll talk about one of the studies soon, but when I was just starting my master's, my professor Anne-Marie Elber, who became my supervisor on my master's, she invited me along to a PhD course where this young researcher, Christopher Henriksen, came and introduced this holistic ecological approach to talent development. And feeling fired up and inspired after his talk, I went straight out and did a study myself. And that was really where I went from there. Yeah.
And that took you to Liverpool John Moores?
Yeah, exactly. Finished my master's after we do a 2-year master's in Denmark. So finished that and then wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do, if I wanted to go straight into applied practice or if I wanted to do a PhD. And I figured out that I wanted to do something that I wasn't quite sure that I could succeed at. So the project in Liverpool was exactly the thing that I wanted to do at the time, and it was a great experience, and that really took me on a journey in sports psychology where I commuted from Denmark working with rowers to London collecting data, and then back to Liverpool, and I just basically did that commute for about 2.5 years, which was really stressful, and I'm happy that I did it, but I would now in hindsight have done it in a different way.
You clocked up some serious air miles and were possibly
Yeah.
practicing all of your stress techniques on yourself?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's interesting feeling that kind of stress that a lot of athletes also feel, and then having to cope with it yourself really provides a really deep learning on different coping mechanisms and skills.
Being the guinea pig for your own ideas. Take us through what specifically you were doing at Liverpool John Moores.
So John Moores, I did what's called an action research project, and the basic tenet is that instead of just collecting data and then analyzing it and then publishing a paper, you collect data, you analyze them, and you feed them straight back into an organization right away. And that would be something a consultant would do. In action research, we just put the added extra analysis, the academic side on. So I did that with one Olympic sports organization, which is anonymous due to some of the findings that we have, over 16 months to look at how a culture changed, so a change of culture. And I see a distinction in change in culture and change of culture, where a change in culture is progressive, it is not a revolution, it happens over time. You learn from your experiences, your mistake, and your history, and then you kind of refine it all the time. But a change of culture is much more radical. It's becoming different. So going from one thing to becoming very different to something else. It's much more revolutionary, can be a bit more violent, and of course we studied the power relationships between people and groups doing that, and that was fascinating and led to probably maybe someone has read this paper on destructive cultures that we published, which is really fascinating. Well, I think it's incredibly fascinating.
Change in culture denotes the kind of the mini day-to-day behaviors that are shifting, that might influence engagement, participation, development, performance outcomes, whereas a change of culture denotes more of a longer term or overt change. Would I be getting that right?
Yeah, I'd say so. I'd say a change of culture is this more radical shift to becoming different, where this change in culture is just day to day negotiations of how we're doing things here where we are.
We'll park that because I'd like to potentially explore that in more detail. In fact, we might do along the journey of this conversation. You mentioned being heavily influenced by Christopher Henriksen and his holistic ecological approach. And the reason why we've teamed up to have this conversation today is because I noticed that you tweeted out. We follow each other on Twitter, and you had tweeted out a paper that you've recently co-authored, well, actually with a number of authors who you can introduce us to. That is a meta-analysis of the holistic ecological approach. I will ask you if it's okay, Niels, to take us through what a meta-analysis is. But why don't you introduce us to this research project, and then we can get cracking talking about holistic ecological approaches.
Yeah, for sure. So this study actually started when I first started my PhD. It's quite normal when you do a PhD in the UK to start doing a systematic review where you look at all the research that is in the field that you're supposed to do your PhD in.
Hmm.
And a meta study is basically just that we roll up a bunch of studies within a specific field, and then we compare and contrast them to figure out, so where are the gaps in research, where can we see to refine them, what are the strengths, and how can we move forward. And that's why there's such a long list of co-authors, because it started with Rob Morris, who was my supervisor at my PhD, and Nora Ronkainen, who was, I guess, a mentor in a sense, and then Martin Littlewood and Dave Richardson, who were my second and third supervisors at John Moores, who I'm also learned too much from. I think that I still trying to make sense of all of it. And then the last author on the paper is Stig Arveseta, who is now the head of the lab, or the sports psychology lab that I'm in now. And he basically helped redo the whole search when I arrived here in Norway to get the last few studies in that were just published in 2020 and 2021.
And so the purpose of the paper really is to look at, summarize previous papers around this holistic ecological approach, analyze and suggest ways of moving forward with this approach.
Exactly. I think I see it as a start of a conversation. The past 10 years have really elaborated on the holistic ecological approach, primarily from Scandinavia. So now we're kind of coming into the second decade, if you will, and often when a new theory or something comes up, the second decade is a lot of refinement to see, okay, so how can we actually make this more robust and more applicable to practitioners who work around the world. And that's really it. It's not really to poke holes in anything. It's just to figure out, so what do we already know, and how do we know it, and how can we actually move forward, and yeah, and also discuss some of the fundamental assumptions in it, because it underpins dual career research now with dual career development environments. There's also research on community practice from Canada that's underpinned by the holistic ecological approach. And there's some talent identification research from the UK that also uses this approach. So it's getting even more important to kind of nail down the theoretical underpinnings of it.
So you have a passion for culture, you have a passion for talent development, And so a big part of your work is studying this holistic ecological approach to talent development. So let's, I suppose, begin at the beginning here, because I haven't really spoken about what actually is the holistic ecological approach to talent development. Take me through that. There's coaches listening in, sort of thinking, "Whoa, holistic ecological approach, what's that?" So let's begin there.
Yeah, it can seem mighty highbrow sometimes, but holistic basically means that we view the person that you are on the field or in the boat or on your skis as intimately linked with the person that you're outside. Like when you go to school, when you go to your work, who you are at home with your family, who you might be at your local chess club. But these two people is not two distinct people, but they're intimately linked. And things that happen outside the arena of sports can influence you inside and vice versa, of course. That's the holistic part of it. And the ecological part is that we look more at the whole environment. So we can have a tendency in sports psychology, talent development to focus pretty narrowly on the influence of the coach or the parents. But the ecological approach will look at what's the influence of peers outside the sport, what's the influence of a chess club or a drawing course or a language course that you're doing, what's the influence of school if you're in dual career mode, what's the influence of the physios, uh, the medical staff, the psychologists, the federation, a bit, which is a bit further out. So that's the ecological part of it.
That's fascinating. And building up a visualization here for coaches. I'm a coach. I'm a coach of young players in the talent development pathway, or just at an academy or a club. A 14-year-old child. I look at that 14-year-old child, and then I'm inclined to look at the behavior. And I may consider my own behavior as a coach with relation to that child's behavior. I may consider their parents, but what you're saying is the holistic ecological approach, especially the ecological side of things, is suggesting we need to visualize that child's behavior with reference to the wider cultural context that child is embedded into, the school and the experiences the school he or she is, or the experiences he or she is having at school, the activities he or she engages in, the wider the wider community and the social norms within that community that again he or she is engaging in. Am I grasping that correctly? You're going deeper into that person's socio-cultural experiences.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I can give an example of a football club we did some research with
Hmm.
in Denmark, and they're nestled in between three different areas and kind of pick up players from these areas when they don't go to FC Copenhagen or they don't go to Brøndby or they don't go to Lyngby, so some of the big talent teams around Copenhagen. So they pick people up from very affluent area or two very affluent areas and one with a bit more deprivation, and two of the areas are quite, I would say, monocultures maybe. Like Denmark, we have about 8% immigrants or descendants of an immigrant, so it is predominantly white. So two of the areas are predominantly white, and one is much more mixed. So when you have players from these three places, you can consider if there's something happening outside the sport that might influence them. Or similarly, when I came to Liverpool, I lived in Toxteth, which is uh, hugely multicultural. And if you coach players from that area, and there's a lot of deprivation also. So if you coach players from that area, it might not be just the family dynamic that's important, but also what's pulling them away from the field, what's pulling at them to not come to training, because there can be a whole host of things. That would be considering the ecological part of it, yeah.
And this approach, the holistic ecological approach, is informed by the work of Bronfenbrenner. I did an episode on this with coach Stuart Wilkinson, rugby coach, rugby league coach. Spent most of my time striving to pronounce Bronfenbrenner correctly, which I'm probably still getting wrong. But would I be correct in that he's quite? I believe again. You can correct me if I'm wrong. A prominent social psychologist. Can you tell me a little bit about his theory that would underpin the holistic ecological approach?
Yeah, sure. So Bronfenbrenner, he's born in 1917 and obviously died, I think, 15, 16 years ago. But his work was hugely influential because he started looking at child development in this much more ecological way. Instead of just looking at how children they develop in school, he started looking at all the influences of child development at different levels. And he has basically three uh, eras to his research. And the first one is really looking at the environment. You look at um, the ecological systems, you look at the microenvironment environment that the child is embedded in. That could be a school, that could be a home setting. You look at who are the important actors in this near microenvironment. And then you can look at what he calls the meso environment, and that will be other microenvironments that the child is engaged in. And then he looks at the macro environment, which is way further out. Um, could be government, how government structures school, how sports federations set up leagues for children. And that's really where he started. And then over time, he went from the ecological approach, which he just looked at the environment, to this bioecological approach. And that's where I think it gets really interesting because that starts looking at the adaptation between the child and the environment. So you don't just look at what's the state of the environment, but you see who is this person in front of you? What is their socio-economic makeup? What is their psychology? What are their experiences? How do they cope with challenge? How do they cope with, I guess, tailwind when things are going well? And then you kind of figure out if there's a good adaptation between the environment uh, and the developing person. And that's a really funny example from my first conference. That was a Russian researcher who put his hand up and asked Christopher Henriksen, who's done this holistic ecological approach in sports, and he asked because they had an athlete in Russia who was in a prison for many years, and in prison learned to become a boxer and thrived in that environment. So, can that be a successful environment to a developing person? And if you're looking at the adaptation, because that person, this person who was in prison, this boxer, apparently thrived in this environment and then developed into an elite athlete. Uh, I don't think I would do very well in such an environment. But there's also environments that, so it's really to figure out, so how is this interaction between the developing person and the environment? That's where his theory kind of ended and where most of us would pick it up now.
Okay, so let's pick it up because I think I'm a sports psychologist. Perhaps I'm biased. I'm fascinated by this, and I know that historically, perhaps my leanings have been biased towards the player, him or herself, and the player's immediate environment, with an appreciation of the distant socio-cultural aspects that will be influencing behaviour, but perhaps not appreciating or looking deeply enough into that interaction. But I do kind of, I'm picturing now coaches sitting, listening to this, and saying, okay, great, fine, fantastic. Wow, this feels like you're layering on a lot of complexity. Okay, I accept complexity, but then we still come back to I've got to
Mm.
coach that person in the middle of all of this. So I'm not saying, well, okay, great, but so what? But I would like to ask you the question. Okay, so there's complexity. There's a lot of interaction between a player's biology and the wider social context that they're within. Now what? Now what does a coach do with that?
So yeah, you probably see that I tell a lot of stories, and that's the way I make sense of things.
Yeah.
But I have another story then. So when I was in working in rowing with a group of under 19-year-olds, we had kind of our national team boat, but we had a bigger environment where we had I think 12 or 14 young lads, and and so one of these guys, was he was a carpenter. He was trained to be a carpenter, and we'd gone through off season and we started preseason. And preseason is pretty tough because we wanted to up their training a little bit to really get them ready for the World Championships and European Championships later that year. And that all happened around New Year's, where the coach really upped the training amount. Like it was harder, it was longer distances. But it just happened that this guy, he started in his placement. So he had been 6 months at school learning or training to be a carpenter, but now he's going into a carpentry company and working there full time. So he had to bike 20 kilometers to work and 20 kilometers home from work and then come to practice in the evening. Also, he spent 7 hours every day laying down floors. So after a couple of weeks there in the new year, we could just see that his performance dropped. He didn't push as hard as he used to. He had to quit one set before everyone else, and he was kind of feeling a little bit distraught. He wasn't really happy with himself, feeling weaker than everyone else. So, and we hadn't at the time, we didn't know that he had started already laying down floors, biking 40 kilometers every day. But kind of seeing that made sure, okay, fair enough. You're actually doing quite a lot of physical activity outside rowing. So we need to adjust the training for you. So we actually gave him an extra day off a week, a little bit less in the weight room and less intervals in training. And wouldn't you know it, a week later he was back to the same push, the same averages, and all was swell. And that's really how you can use the holistic ecological approach to inform what you're doing. You see that something outside the sport is actually influencing how they're doing in the sport, because otherwise, if we hadn't seen that, he would have been on his way to overtraining. Yeah, that's one story. I have one more with something
Please.
different. Yeah, so this is also a rower. So she's 22 years old on the under 23 national team and training to be an engineer. And there was really high hopes for their lightweight double sculls for the under 23 World Championships, but her rowing partner come to me and say, I think she's really struggling. My partner, we can't really train as much. She's not really happy. She seems tired. So I go and have a chat with her partner here, and we figure out that her work in school is so intense at the moment with studying and reading and exams, and she's just moved away from home on top of all that. So she's training to the under 23 World Championships. She's going through exams in a very vigorous engineering course, and she's moving away from home. So there's three things pulling at her at the same time. And again, we can see that she's just not thriving in this at the moment. And again, instead of adapting school to her sport, we adapt sport to her school. And then we see gradual improvement over a few weeks, and then they actually did really well in that under 23 world champs, that team, and she went on to do really great in the season after too. But there are those times where there's a lot of things pulling at you from different angles, and where if you have this complexity in mind, you can see, okay, it might not just be one thing. There's all these different stresses.
I think it's fascinating, and I think that it makes me think of several things. It makes me think that part of the demand on a coach is to take that holistic viewpoint, is to consider the wider reasons as to why an athlete, a participant or competitor, is behaving as they are. I think that's just so important. As you were speaking there, I mean, where the one defines the Danish under 19 rowing team as developing elite or elite is, I suppose, a hot potato at the moment. What is elite? But I suppose if I was to orient now towards the very elite, I'm fascinated by this notion of adapting sport and participation in sport to somebody's life rather than the other way around. Do you think there's tolerance at, I mean, we're just going to the end here, to the very elite level, the first team level, the Olympic first team rowers, if you like. Do you think there's room in elite sport to adapt the sport and the demands of the sport to somebody's life rather than the other way around? Do you think there's the tolerance there, and do you think there's the room to do that?
My experience is that it's different in the two countries I have a lot of experience in, like in the UK and Denmark.
Tell me about that.
So in Denmark, it is almost impossible to be a professional athlete if you're not a footballer or a handball player. Or Victor Axelsen, of course, the badminton player. But one of the elite athletes that we often had come talk to our younger athletes in rowing, she went to the Olympics a couple of times. She medaled at the World Championships at the senior level. I would categorize her as a top elite athlete. But she worked part-time and full-time in a chocolate factory on the side. So she was a food scientist.
Oh, wow.
And basically her job accommodated her. So she could work full-time in the beginning of Olympic cycle and then part-time when it was really crunch time. And you'd see the same in a lot of Danish Olympic sports. Like all of our sailors, they go to university or work part-time jobs probably, and same with our track and field athletes. It's different in the UK because the system is different. There are larger but not super large grants that athletes get from the sports federations, and in the UK there are sports federations where they see being a lead athlete as a job. You arrive at the training center at 9 a.m., you leave at 5, and that's all throughout the week. And those hours make it virtually impossible or extremely difficult, at least, to carry out any kind of schooling next to it, or undertake an apprenticeship or work. So it can be done, but it's very much up to the way that your philosophy is in the individual federations, which can be difficult because, I mean, luckily the thing in the UK is that university starts a little bit earlier in the UK compared to Denmark. So I only started university when I was 21, and in the UK people would often start when they're 18, finish at 21, and then you have your whole elite career comes after that. But the stories about Danish athletes who start at 22 and probably peak around 30, and they're still in university because it's a very good environment because you're subsidized from the state, and it's something that's low threshold ish if you're part-time. But it depends on the greater environment, the way you approach it.
Yeah.
There are definitely sports in the UK where it's impossible. And if you look at football, the examples, William Kvist, who played in Stuttgart, he also played in Fulham. He has a master's from a business school that he undertook. Playing professional footballers in Denmark undertake education because that is something where you can actually have quite a lot of time or downtime where you can do something else than being in the gym. It's just not it's often something that happens. And I might not, is this a tall tale? Or I think, is it Bonucci or Cellini who has a PhD? It might be something someone just told me, but it can definitely happen.
I don't know, but I did read something recently. I think it's Chiellini who has something. I'm not sure. I don't know if it's a PhD or if it's a master's. But returning back to that talent development pathway, because I've directed us towards the very elite level there, but the talent development pathway, in essence, what you're saying is a sophisticated approach is to consider the not just the immediate environment, but the wider cultural context that the person in front of you that you're coaching, the people in front of you you're coaching, come from the experiences that they've had. So for the coach of the under 12s, the under 14s, up to and beyond, the college coach who's recruited players, it's to consider the context the cultural context that they've grown up in bears greatly on the behaviours that the coach is seeing. So perhaps to have a wider lens in that respect, and then to help from there. That's what I'm hearing from you.
Yeah, and you're right. It's really tricky because so if you're a sports psychologist, you can really quickly get into the humanistic existential psychology where you work with the whole person. Also, you work with the experiences and help people make sense of all the complexities of life. But that will still focus very much on the individual person. But the ecological psychology just makes this much wider view of things. So you need to consider what's the relationship between the athlete and the peers, and maybe even speak to the peers and how are things going. So we had a student last year doing a master's asking school administrators or talking to school administrators about how they support their students at high school level, at the college level, in the UK, who move away from home to do a focused sport degree at that level. So how do they support those if they move from home? And instead of asking the athletes how they cope with it, we just ask the student administrators instead. That would be the ecological side compared to like a more humanistic where you look at the individual person.
So let's return to your paper. So you did a meta-analysis of studies into this approach over the past decade.
Yeah.
What did you find?
Yeah, so actually it's a decade and a year. We kind of cheated and brought in a couple of papers in from 2021. So what we found, if you want to go really nitty gritty and into the really nerdy stuff about the research, I think we found some extremely robust papers. All of the studies that we included used multiple data collection approach, and that's quite novel to see. And I think one of the reasons is that a lot of people, they applied both observations and interviews in some form, either unstructured or semi-structured or unofficial, official. That's one thing we found. Another thing we found is that there's some maybe inconsistency in the use of Bronfenbrenner. There's a very good definition of holistic ecological approach that talks about the progressive mutual accommodation between the person and the environment. But a lot of the research was kind of underpinned by Bronfenbrenner's early work, where you only really look at the environment and not really this progressive mutual accommodation. So to us, at least, we think that if you move forward with this, it would be interesting to look more at this accommodation between the environment and the developing person. And that would probably include doing longitudinal research, which is extremely difficult in a publish or perish academic world. But hopefully that's something we can do here, at least to look at. I think that was one thing we picked up on. Then we picked up on the organizational culture, of course, and the way that culture has been approached in this research. And if you look at the environments that are classified as successful, all of the successful environments except one has a coherent culture where everything is lined up and works and everything is neat and beautiful. But if you start looking at the papers, actually compare and contrasting them, I think there's some cracks in the lacquer. You can kind of see there's some issues there, that they might not actually be homogeneous or integrated. But the view that's employed in this kind of research is an integration approach where everyone must agree on the same values, the same basic assumptions, and the same artifacts. And outside sports, that's been really discredited quite a lot because it's a bit more complicated than that. And there is something in the Scandinavian culture where we kind of imagine that we're all the same. Men and women are the same, different ethnicities are the same, and being different is kind of problematic, and that makes us a bit conflict averse, but it also creates a lot of conformity. So maybe in Scandinavia, it could be like that. But definitely my experience from being in the UK is that it's much more complicated and differentiated, where values are contested and negotiated constantly. I mean, just take a value which we see as completely fundamental, such as teamwork, and think, how do a football team relate to the value of teamwork? And then how do a rowing team to teamwork? What about a fencing team? Because in a fencing team, there's one fencer fencing another person, and there's three outside, and then they switch. So values that we see as fundamental can be viewed completely different depending on your experiences and your upbringing and your own personal life.
Well, can I briefly offer an example there
Mhm.
from the world of professional golf, and that's the Ryder Cup, whereby you could argue, and it's fairly well documented, that in the United States over the last 50 years, pound for pound, they have developed the better individual golfers who go on and win more majors. There was a period in the 90s into the noughties where a lot of Europeans were winning majors and still win the occasional major. But by and large, over the last 50 years, you'd say the Americans have produced the better individual golfers. And it's a very individualized, or it feels a very individualized culture on the US tour. Again, historically, there's talk of players dining on their own and seeing their fellow competitors as rivals, which they absolutely are, where there's more of a community feel. Again, anecdotal evidence here, but more of a community feel on the European tour. And if you look at the results, the outcomes of the Ryder Cup over the last, say, 40 years, or at least since the Ryder Cup turned from GB&I, Great Britain and Ireland, versus United States to Europe in the early 80s, Europe have won more Ryder Cups with supposed inferior players. And it's said that the Americans struggle to team as a consequence of the culture that they're immersed in, week out on the US tour, relative to the culture that the Europeans experience.
Yeah, I think you're right on that. That's if you look outside sports research and culture, you see that there's distinction between loose cultures and tight cultures. And looser cultures would be something like the US. I'd also say that England, Great Britain is more of a looser culture, especially compared to Denmark, which is a very tight culture. I think some of the tightest cultures are traditionally Middle Eastern cultures, but that's So that's also something you need to consider using this approach and working with it. But looking at it as much more differentiated, like in the UK, as a sports psychologist or a coach, if you want to be really apt at working with culture, I'd say instead of trying to control a culture from top down, which has been suggested plenty of times in sports research, you should be much more adept at working in between subcultures. So if you're in a professional football team and you have players from Brazil who largely view meaning in sport as something they attach to religion, and you have British players where their skill is something they work for, they worked hard for, and how do you manage those subcultures in a sport? You have to be very good at being in that kind of space in between subcultures and being good at seeing these different subcultures. I think that's really the way forward if you want longevity and high performance.
A little example there. I courted some controversy with one of my daily LinkedIn posts a couple of years ago. I critiqued a pundit's assessment of the behaviour of Brazilian players, a few Brazilian players who played for one specific English-based Premier League team. And those players were joyful and smiling and almost like dancing prior to kickoff. And I think they were also on opposing teams. And again, they were quite social and lively with each other, even though they were on opposing teams. And I sort of said I felt the pundit misread those social cues, because that pundit's been very socialized into one definition of competitiveness, which is this very macho British tunnel vision, go smash 'em lads, that type of things, to put it crudely. Whereas for me, in that, let's say, Brazilian culture, without being too cliche about it, competitiveness is a dance almost. It's wrong footing your opponent. It's capoeira. It's movement. It's, you could say that competitiveness in Spain is space and relationships between space and ball and player. You could say in Italy, if we're continuing to talk football here, it's a robust cognitive process applied to defensive duties. It's so different, and you can't just define, let's say, competitiveness in one way, or at least I'm exploring the disparate cultural variations of competitiveness. So I just think, as you're saying, it's what you said there made me think of that. It made me think of, we live in a especially in the UK, in the English Premier League, we live in a multicultural competitive environment where people from around the world will come in. Well, we have to understand and appreciate where they've come from, what they've experienced, and what their definition, what behaviors they embrace around these things, such as engagement and learning and performance and competitiveness.
Yeah, you're right, and I think that's what comes with being culturally competent, I guess, for lack of a better word. But having experience working in I've lived in Denmark, Canada, England, and now in Norway. And even though we're all in, what we say, the global north or the Western world, they're extremely different in the way we go about it. And having that knowledge, if you can bring someone in who has knowledge of and understanding of how different people work, how different people argue, can be really helpful. Like, take the Dutch. The Dutch are extremely blunt. They get right to the point. So much so that it can seem almost rude to a Brit. And a Brit is often very polite and maybe not as much to the point and not as direct. And the same, Danish people can be construed as blunt. Like, we don't have a word in Danish for please. So can I have a cup of tea, please? Can I have this, please? We don't say that, because if we say the Danish word for it, it seems like we're begging for it. Like we're on our knees. Can I please have a cup of tea? Like, was it Oliver Twist?
Please, sir, can I have some more?
Exactly. So those subtleties are extremely important, and that's going back to the paper. That's really one of the things we hope for when we move forward. And where we think this holistic ecological approach can be applied better to more multicultural, more loose national cultures, is if you loosen up the cultural framework that you're doing research with, instead of keeping it as focused on integration, because there are a lot of organizations that produce elite athletes or develop elite athletes, which are not coherent, homogeneous cultures. Far cry from it.
And they can potentially be unsafe and unhealthy cultures?
Sure. I think we've seen some examples of that off late. Just recently, we had a really interesting case in Denmark in professional football, where they hired a coach from Germany, and the first thing he did was put 4 of the senior players on the under 19 team. And these are 4 players who were the stars last year, and they have a huge, very long career of high performance behind them. He just put them on an under 19 team because he didn't want all players, because they wanted all the power. And of course, what happened over the next 2 months was that this just escalated more and more and more. And stories came out of him bullying the players, and the club just released players left, right, and center, hired players. And in the end, the coach left because he was followed, he was pursued, his family received threats. He had a phone call from his mom, who called him crying, "Is it really true? Have you really done all these things?" And that's a destructive culture. That's because 2 sides are fighting for power, and we have no idea what actually happened. It's just it just went completely sideways.
And I suppose the converse of what you've just spoken about there with that Danish football team is a part of your findings suggested that psychological safety is potentially an important ingredient within an adaptive culture, within one that defines itself or utilizes a holistic ecological approach. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I once heard a researcher into psychological safety say that it's the worst branded term in management, because it kind of seems soft. But if you kind of dive into it, it's amazing. It's not about cuddling people. It's not about not actually discussing things or critiquing each other. It's about knowing that there is mutual respect between everyone involved in the team or in the group, and that you can say your meaning, that you're allowed to speak up and challenge and check each other, and that you won't be belittled or attacked for doing so. That's part of psychological safety. And in a team, it seems that places where you can actually speak up, try new things, that's where people have more development, more learning. And on the other hand, if you have a very integrated culture, you can become conflict averse, you can be lulled into safety, you can get swept up in routines over time, and you actually there's a limited development in that, and it's a very fine line between that. But I think that's something that I'd hope see more of in this kind of research.
And so I'm just trying to connect the dots here. Psychological safety being, as you say, the capacity to challenge, check and challenge, the culture that allows you to express vulnerability, a culture that enables participation. What has this got to do with the holistic ecological approach? How does that go hand in hand?
Well, it really comes back to this part about the culture bit.
Yeah.
Because if we look at creating integrated cultures where everybody sing from the same hymn sheet, is something a lot of people would like to say, that we're using the same language about everything. That can actually work quite detrimental. It can create hegemony, basically control from the top down. You can only say things in this way. Uh, this is how you actually do things, and this is where you really create this integrated culture where everybody just goes one way, and over time it might falter. It might work for a while, but then what we see in that research, if using that, is that you go through cycles of functionality and complete destruction. Functionality, complete destruction. That's basically what you see in football, where you have a manager for a while and everybody backs him up, and then nobody backs him up. Fire the manager, new manager. Then you see a performance gain, and then you just go through these cycles. And that can be maybe not having been in all organizations who've ever fired a manager, but that's if you see that. So in some, if you kind of create this super tight hymn sheet that everybody must follow, that can inhibit learning, because there's a threat of embarrassment or um, threat that you can feel if you step outside that to try something new. Especially when you talk about the Brazilians and the English players together, there's much more creativity maybe on one side. Not saying that they're not creative Englishmen, but it could be hard stepping outside those bonds.
I gotcha. So when we appreciate the cultural context that individuals come from and groups come from, and we have those individuals or those groups within our organization, under one umbrella, it's appreciating that having one homogenized set of rules or behaviors or values, and the insistence of adhering to those rules, set and values and or behaviors can actually be quite claustrophobic, can actually cause problems. It's not to dismiss the notion that, you know, the notion of having values and rules and behaviors. It's just being robust enough to appreciate individual differences with relation to those rules, behaviors, and values. Something that we talked about with
Yeah,
Suze Burton-Wiley on the Sports Psych show. Would I be correct there?
yeah, exactly. Yeah, she would definitely know her stuff on that. And it's just it is interesting, because I'm not saying that a club or a coach should not sit down with their team and have a chat about how do we think we should do things here. But perhaps the better word is philosophy. This is how we think about things here, and we can kind of agree on a few rules here. But culture is it's much different. Culture is like you're a drop in the Mississippi, you're a speck of sand in the Sahara. You matter, but it's really hard to change things.
Yeah, well, I suppose it's doing some, to put it in its simplest possible terms, I suppose it's doing some heavy lifting around those kind of conversations, isn't it? Because I think a lot of organisations now engage themselves in a session around values, let's just say, and the associated behaviours related to those values, but they don't necessarily explore what those values and behaviours mean to specific individuals. Yeah,
But if I could just
yeah,
jump on
please.
that really quick, because I think you should actually do that, and I've done that. But you have to think about what you're doing it for. Are you doing it to create a tight culture where you almost create groupthink?
Mm.
Well, if that's what you're doing, then do it. But if you're doing it to exactly explore how different people from different upbringings, from different cultures, from different nations, they view the same values, values become, well, pluralistic, like for a very fancy word. There's If you have a team of 20 hockey players from Wales, from Bath, from Edinburgh, from Inverness, Isle of Man, there's probably 20 different views on what constitutes hard work.
And whether hard work is needed or not.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So use those sessions for creating more awareness in the group. I think that's much healthier than trying to create a tight culture, which can create groupthink or create a lack of interpersonal risk taking or something like that.
Have you ever had pushback on that from coaches who might say, okay, Niels, I hear you, but wow, that just feels chaotic. It feels out of control. How on earth do I establish any kind of consistency of behavior here?
Yeah, of course. Of course, I have. Giving up control for a lot of people is extremely uh,
Stressful.
frightening, I guess. Like think about just your exactly. It's stressful. Like just think about your body. You can almost control most things in your body. Like you can control your breath at least for a little while. Um, but I think one of the things in our body that we're so frightened of is perspiration, because there's no chance we can actually control perspiration, is there? And that kind of comes with kind of a stigma because it's uncontrollable. Um, and that's almost how it can be sometimes. But if you look at modern pedagogy, like non-linear pedagogy, yeah, putting the locus of control to the learner with non-linear pedagogy, you have to choose how we do this. You have to be creative. That takes away control from the teacher, from the coach. Think about acceptance commitment uh, therapy, which is hugely successful in elite sports psychology. It's about accepting that you cannot control your thoughts, the thoughts that come and go, and you have to accept that to kind of live with unproductive thoughts. And so letting go of control is mega hard. Like I'm doing it right now with my fellow teachers or my fellow lecturers here in our course on sports psychology, that I want the students to lead way more and not just us standing here with our privileged knowledge and telling the students what is right or wrong. I want them to step across the river and kind of take control of their own learning. And that is probably that is I know from some of them who's told me that it's a bit frightening, stressful, like loosening the reins in a way.
One more slight challenge there. As you're speaking, I'm thinking of cognitive load. That
Mm-hmm.
looking at the people in front of you, the players in front of you, and saying, and I don't want to caricature what you're saying, but you players, people, have to sort yourselves out. You have to guide this. You have to find the solutions here. May increase cognitive load, may make this a
Mm.
more challenging environment for the players, for the people in front of you. And part of a coach's job is to strip back the noise, is to orient them towards the signal
Mm-hmm.
and the signals associated
Mm.
with learning and high performance, rather than this chaotic mess.
Yeah, yeah, certainly. I think going back to this holistic ecological approach, when you talk to coaches about all of this, is how do you make sure that this isn't too complex for the athlete? And that's often where the coach or a talent manager or a head of welfare, or head of education in a football club is kind of a filter. It's not like the athletes; they have to deal with what the federation says they should or shouldn't do. That's filtered in through the club. They only really have to deal with a lot of the stuff that's in their immediate environment.
Mm.
But I agree that like I look at my students right now and we change this approach, and sometimes I just see eyes that are glazed over because whoa, this has been a lot. Um, so of course it's also supporting that. It's being what I'd see it as being more of a guide than a source of real knowledge. Um, because you need people to do and make decisions on the fly, and especially in complex sports where uh, where they have to make moment to moment decisions. It can be tricky if you try to take out your PlayStation 5 controller and play FIFA with your players, and especially if you're doing something like sailing, uh, the the distance between a coach and the sailor is a kilometer, maybe at times two, three, both in training, and also in in competition. And I don't know if you've ever been on a boat in rowing. The only thing the rowers can hear is like the rhythm of the coach, because there's such a lot of sound from the engine or something. So how do you actually manage those things? And that's giving them more agency, giving the athletes more agency.
Interesting. To finish off,
Mm-hmm.
and I suppose the challenge here is for you to describe this in a nutshell. If I'm the lead psychologist at a six club being soccer club in England, Premier League club, and I've been tasked to help enhance the culture of the club. And I phone up you, Niels, and I say, Niels, I just love this holistic ecological approach. I need some help here with regard to what you found from your meta-analysis. How can I strive to enhance this culture? In a nutshell, what kind of things can I be going back and talking to my coaches about? We've probably summarized quite a bit over the course of the last hour, but in a nutshell, what things might you be saying to me?
I think you're touching on the area that's under. Uh, People don't focus as much on the systemics or systems level psychology, especially in educating young sports psychologists. So a lot of sports psychologists come out with a lot of experience and ideas and approaches to work on a one-to-one level with a coach or an athlete. But working at the systems level is really working with each of the groups that have interaction with the athletes. So if you think about how can you enhance the culture, it's about supporting the coaches, supporting the physios, the strength and conditioning coaches, to see where the players are coming from, where the other staff members are coming from. We spoke about this value session. So sure, you can talk about values, you can talk about how we do things in our club, but you need to make sure that it's about understanding where everyone comes from, or everyone are coming from. So what does it actually mean to you, and how can you and I collaborate? What does this mean to you, and how can we collaborate so we actually want to take risks and we want to try to enhance each other? So that's at least one way. At another level, if you work from this holistic ecological approach, you'd also think that you as a psychologist, you're not just there to support the players or the coaches. You can also support, say, physios. Psychologists, we often work from the neck up. The physios work kind of from the neck down. But if a psychologist and a physiotherapist work together, maybe you can work with the whole person. In Norway, they call it psychomotor physiotherapy, which is actually a very strong tradition up here, where if you have anxiety in the body from injury and fear of re-injury, working with the head, the mind, and the body can actually help quite a lot. So those are some of the ways.
Fascinating stuff. Well, Niels, this has just been such a fascinating hour or so, and I know you would have really tapped the interest of the listener. I know that you're a keen Twitter user, and that's how we met and first engaged. So, with all that in mind, how can people follow you, read your stuff, and if you want to be found, how can you be, or want to be contacted, how can you be contacted?
Yeah, the easiest is probably contacting me via my work email. It's on the paper. I don't know if you're putting a link to the paper somewhere. The tricky thing is that we swap the E and the I in the Niels, so it's Niels. Otherwise, on Twitter, NIELS_NTNU. That's probably where I'll put most of my work out. And I think you and a lot of the psychologists in the area will be really interested in what we've got coming up, because for the last 6 months I've been interviewing 16 sports psychologists who work in professional football in academies, from 10 from Cat 1, 3 from Cat 2, and 3 from Cat 3, to really look at the development of psychology in football. And I'm just right now have chapters in front of me of humanistic psychology and how psychology is introduced in professional football. So I think there's some really interesting stuff coming up. So people should keep tabs on that.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be a cue to get you back on the show. I think we'll have to talk about that one. Well, look, that's been really, really fascinating, and I can't thank you enough for your time.
Excellent. Thank you very much for hosting. It's been a joy.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.